Good morning. This is the video for June, something that came out of class on Monday, which was chaining different kinds of attacks to threaten the quadrants. I thought would make a good video for June because some good points of discussion came out of it. So just as a quick reminder, in German longsword, the body's broken up into 4 quadrants. So you've got an upper left and right and lower left and right. And one of the things that I found is that often longsword practitioners don't tend to transition between thrusts and cuts very well. And mixing those when you're chaining together attacks is very valuable. So a lot of times people get very, choppy, very cut centric, or maybe they'll get a little thrust centric for a couple passes, but they don't go back and forth between the two. And thrusts are a really good way to set up cuts because people tend to find thrusting very scary and you tend to get a bigger oh shit reaction. So what we did is we took a very simple setup and we kind of worked the concepts through that and then kind of built off of that. So one of my favorite setups is a high thrust to a midline cut. And specifically what we are doing is we're targeting the opponent's upper left to get them to move not just left, but left and up to open this midline or this kind of hip line right. So we're getting them to move up and left because it's going to take them longer to move back down and right. So we don't just want side to side, but we want kind of this diagonal threat. And so whether you're using a right foot back and then passing forward, or you have a right foot lead and you want to gather or lunge forward, what we're going to do is we're going to threaten the opponent's upper kind of left chest throat area with a thrust. And we want to make sure that we still have good structure. So even though this might be a feint, we don't want to be knuckles down. We still want to turn the palm up so that if there's some blade contact, we have good structure. And if the opponent is in any kind of a central guard, this makes it very easy because you can essentially choose which way someone defends with your thrust. You just threaten one side of the blade or the other. So we're going to be, again, targeting the opponent's upper left kind of chest throat area. And so I'm going to do this with this kind of high line thrust and my palm up. And then the next part is when they parry that point off the line, I'm going to turn the little wheel. This does 2 things. One is this keeps me safe because the sword stays between me and the bad guy. So in case somebody goes parry thrust or parry's kind of spazzy attack, if I come big release around trying to go to my next thing, I might get spaz hit and that sucks. So we're going to thrust, we're going to turn the little wheel, and I'm going to push my pommel, I'm going to step and turn and attack that low right hip or belt line. And the nice thing about a thrust to cut in this way is that although you're not really moving faster, rather than kind of the tick-tocky 1-2 of 2 cuts, with this thrust to cut, with this kind of little wheel, you effectively get a tempo acceleration as well. And so it can feel like both a space misdirection where they're going and a little bit of a time misdirection as well. So when I practice this on my pel, I still have my little central tape lines, and I make sure that I'm stabbing just to, for me, the right of my central tape line, because I really want to threaten my opponent's upper left, and they're going to be moving the sword over, and then I turn the little wheel to make sure that I stay safe, and then I'm going to step and pivot out, because again, I've gotten their sword moving up and that way, so I want to go away from their sword, both for my own safety and because it's going to be easier for me to land that secondary cut. So if I do this at the camera, thrust, turn, cut. And then because I've ended up on this side of the sword, it can be very easy to come back and make sure that I'm covered in case there is an afterblow if you play to that rule set, or in SEA heavy the person doesn't like the cut and keeps coming, or the person just doesn't process for a minute and swings anyway because they weren't expecting to get hit, which I do find happens sometimes. So in this very simple setup, we have mixing attacks, thrust to a cut. We have threatening different quadrants of the body, forcing people high and left to expose this low and right. And I think that's a really good set. One of the other things that came from this as well was the idea of not having to commit the sword to trick your opponent. Essentially, feints are lies. We are lying to our opponent about what is about to happen. And so we can lie with the sword, and we also can and should lie with the body. So a good feint is a lie that involves both. And so one of the things I was finding with students especially when we started adding an application, is that students were kind of locking out their sword. And I don't really want to do that. If I kind of do this sideways so people can see, I need to move my body and sword only as much as my opponent needs to believe my lie. So when I practice this on the pedal, I don't actually make contact, because what I want is, as soon as I see my opponent starting that parry, I want to be already going on to the next thing. And so I don't just lock out my arms, I start to shift my weight and extend my arms. But I don't tend to let my weight get too far forward, because I don't need to. As soon as I see my opponent start to move, I want to be going on to the next thing. Because the other thing with these kind of feints is, if I can get my opponent moving and then in motion I'm going to the next thing, they have to stop that motion, reverse it, and come back, and that takes even more time. That's why I really want to commit as little of my blade to contact on theirs as possible. If only this much of my blade is crossed by theirs, that's way better than if they get this high up on my blade and now I have to get around that much more. So make sure when you're practicing this that it's not a very locked out kind of sword-centric thing. It's a body and a weapon motion, because we're going to lie with our sword and our body, and then as soon as we see that the opponent has bought the lie, we go on to the next thing. And this became even more important when we started talking about how to get a bigger oh shit response, because I think it's fine, and you have to, if this is a new motion for you, practice this very mechanically. Here I am in my guard, here I am with my extension, here I am with my little turn, here I am with my cut. Great. But in a fight, that's not necessarily it's not going to play out that way. So one of the things we talked about was using a little bit of a disengaging threat, so that when we did extend, people had a bigger oh shit response. And when I first set the students out to do that, I was seeing a lot of big extension, little turn, and then cut around. So if I do this at the camera, they were extending, doing a little wrist disengage, and that's okay, but it's a little robotic, and again, it's kind of committing the whole sword. And so what I was trying to explain to a couple of the students is, I want you to threaten them without committing your sword. And so all that really takes is a little bit of this motion. I just need people to feel twitchy. So I will shift my weight and I will disengage my sword. But if you can see, I'm never committing my weapon. So I'm using my body, my weight shifting. I'm not even taking a step. I'm just shifting my weight with this disengage to make people feel like they have to start addressing that. And then when you do that extension, usually people go, oh shit, and they'll get that kind of bigger motion, which is going to make everything that comes after that work better. So in addition to threatening quadrants, in addition to using mixed attacks to chain things together, now we're talking about using the body and the weapon in a more subtle way. So that's this kind of a game, just moving and getting people feeling threatened, is much more subtle than, and frankly, I think works more effectively in real sparring. And then the last little piece we talked about was just kind of application. So we have a set of motions, and the last thing we did is, rather than using this as a proactive, where I start the attack, I do my misdirection, I go to the next thing, we started doing this as a reaction. So if I'm in my central guard and somebody does a thrust to me, I can parry and then counter thrust, and we've all seen that. And then if the person parries it to the side, we roll right into the same kind of system of movements. So I do my parry, I thrust, and if they kick, and I'm again threatening that high right on the opponent. So ideally I'm gonna stab them right in the throat. So I do my parry, I'm gonna do my high thrust, and as soon as they parry, I just roll right back around, and we can see we're now using the same set of motions, the same setup, the same mixed attacks, the same threatening of different quadrants, but we're using it from a reactive place where we're parrying and countering. And I think this is often overlooked, because I see people, when they have counters, they're often singular, bam, bam, and then they're done. And if it doesn't land, well, then they just go on to the next, they kind of reset and try again. But we can use these same chained attacks, this mix of attacks is threatening different quadrants, off of counters as well. So if I do my parry and I counter thrust and the person's very good and they stop it, I can just roll right into the next thing. And there's lots of examples. I just wanted to use a consistent set of motions to try to work these concepts, because I think if you try to throw a bunch of techniques at students trying to highlight a bunch of concepts, it's overwhelming. But if we take one set of techniques, or even one technique, and we use it to demonstrate multiple concepts, I think that works out a little bit better for most people, because they don't have to worry about the technical motion so much as understanding what's going on. So this was maybe a little rambly, but like I said, this is a kind of a discussion that came out of a lesson at Monday night's class, so I thought I'd make a video for it because I had fun, and I thought maybe you would as well.